How does one fund the opening of an OBL?
Assuming you don't have access to money by selling your third vacation home in Miami or a rich uncle deep in your family tree, you'll have to find financing sources to pay for your outpatient lab. This costs a lot of money. So let's leave aside ASCs, ambulatory surgery centers, for another day. That's a different animal which costs millions of dollars, largely due to regulations involved. For outpatient office-based labs such as these facilities can be built. I've done it on a shoestring budget starting at the low end of around the $400,000 range all the way up to the $1.2 million range. At the simplest level, financing for such a project can be done by seeking out a loan, typically from direct lending from a bank. But let's say you're uncomfortable with that level of risk. You can cede some of that risk and responsibility by approaching a managed services organization, an MSO, which comes in many different forms. The differences in approach all comes down to one of risk and control. If you go to a large MSO that is in the business of building these types of office-based labs, you give up a certain degree of control over your day-to-day operations. But on the other hand, you also give up a large amount of financial risk. Since they are taking on some of the financial risk with the facility, they will expect a return on this investment. So typically, you can leave it to them. Typically, they will do some of the due diligence on the feasibility of opening an OBL. Now, let's say you don't want your bank account to be at risk for a personal guarantee for a long-term lease on a facility, which may or may not pan out. Well, the MSO organization may be willing to take on this risk, but it's going to be sometimes at the cost of losing personal control over your facility. So honestly, at the end of the day, it's important for you to ask who your funding source is and what level of control you're willing to cede in exchange for this funding. Odds are, if you left a hospital-based practice, you don't want to replace your old boss, the administrator in the C-suite, with a new boss who's in an MSO, who will tell you what devices you can use and what procedures you can do. A lot of us who seek this outpatient environment don't like an administrator in a suit mandating the type of care to be provided. So you may want to avoid a funding source who's asking for that level of control into your daily operations.
So Dr. Tahara, tell me, a lot of early career docs ask me, a lot of fellows ask me, how do I approach funding an outpatient-based practice? What are some approaches? How did you approach it?
So how I approached it is probably going to be fundamentally different than somebody's very earlier in their career. The way I approached it was, since the vast motivator for me was clinical independence, I didn't really want to partner with somebody and have potentially my clinical independence, abrogated because of financial considerations or pressures, almost as if you're still stuck in a hospital system. So I made the decision to do that alone, and I self-funded everything, and I actually self-funded it from savings. I basically threw my life savings into it. Not everybody's going to do that, and not everybody's going to be willing to do that. There are different models. You can do, some risk-shared models. There are a number of companies that help develop these things. You can certainly take out loans for all or pieces of this. Some of it depends on, do you own or have access to suitable real estate, and how much is it going to cost you to remodel? And a lot of it is equipment costs, and then getting your consumables stocked, and then figuring out a business plan that's going to make sense with staffing and everything else. So I think you can approach this either by doing it yourself. You can certainly approach it by doing it yourself, but incurring loans, or you can approach this by doing it or partnering with an organization that would help you with the startup costs in return for some equity and likely decision-making in the entire practice or the entire facility. And I don't think there's a right answer. I think you have to metric that depending on your own personality and your own risk tolerance, and certainly your own where you sit in life.
So Dr. Gorin, tell me, opening an OBL can be a very expensive proposition. How do you fund the building of an OBL or an ASC? How did you approach it? What would you recommend to others?
Sure. Well, so my own experience is that I was in private practice with a group of a multi-specialty surgical group. So I had some general and thoracic surgeons in my group, but I was the vascular surgeon to do this. But so what I didn't have to do was fund sort of a de novo practice. I had the clinic and all of that sort of part, and I needed to add on an office-based center to it. So when you look at that piece, it's not that you have to come up with a huge amount of cash or get a huge loan. You need space. So in our case, we had to add on to our office, so we just mortgaged that. But my whole group owned the building. You could lease it, if you're leasing your space, you work with your landlord, and then you just basically work out a deal in terms of your monthly rent. So that's a monthly lease that you sign on to. Your equipment's the same way. Basically, all of your capital expense things like your C-arm, your pressure injector, your table, your monitors for your patients, and so on, are all things that you can lease, either in a fair market lease to own or a fair market lease that you basically have it for 5 years and then surrender it, which is basically what we've done, on the idea that by 5 years, most of the technology has been replaced and you're going to want to upgrade. As far as your disposables and high-end things like stents, catheters, balloons, and so on, usually if you partner with industry people if you're doing this, you already have those relationships in place, and they'll help you out with that, and in terms of consigning a lot of what you need, so that you can usually get your shelves stocked with all of the equipment that you need without a big capital outlay. So there's a certain amount that you need to do that is cash, right? You're going to need to get stretchers. You're going to need to get, bandages and IV equipment and, things like that. So, but that's fairly easily financed. And in fact, we did that as simply as put it on a credit card and paid it off in a month. So, I did not have to go to the bank and do a big loan or any of those kinds of things. Now, if I were on my own and I had no office and no infrastructure and was starting a practice from zero, well, that requires a lot of other things, because you wouldn't have an electronic medical record, you wouldn't have any of the equipment for exam rooms and your front desk and all of that stuff. But at least in my experience, that wasn't my situation.
So, Dr. Dipple, tell me, how do you fund the building of an outpatient-based practice?
Well, it's like probably starting any other business as well. I think there's a couple options. You can either have partners, you can have investors, you can go to the bank and take out a loan, or if you happen to be fortunate enough, you can use your own resources. I think it really depends on the individual. Probably the majority of the ones that I am familiar with, most people have investors or multiple partners that are all contributing.